es un gusto presentar a Louis-Philippe Rochon. Louis-Philippe Rochon es un gran amigo que lo conocimos en su inicio en varios encuentros de los post-keynesianos, ¿verdad? En Tennessee, en Kansas City y en el Levy Economic Institute, y también es un activo coordinador de libros, de innumerables libros en los cuales hemos participado. También ha coordinado números en la revista de Paul Davidson, la revista de los post-Keynesians, y también él ha hecho desde hace varios años unos encuentros en Dijon, pues con el Centro de Estudios de la Moneda y Finanzas de la Universidad de Borgoña, en Dijon, y hoy incluso ese centro donde participa Louis-Philippe va a ser un encuentro en Copenhague en el mes de mayo. Él es un amigo muy inquieto y también alumno y conocedor de lo que han sido las aportaciones de Alan Pargués precisamente a lo que es la teoría monetaria y la endogeneidad del dinero. Entonces, también está organizando un evento, un homenaje a Alan Pargués a finales de mayo y primeros días de junio en Toronto, Canadá, y donde van a ir varias gentes muy importantes. Bueno, él es egresado de la New School for Social Research y se graduó con el trabajo Dinero, Crédito y Producción. Bien, pues es muy amplio su currículum, ya no quito el tiempo leyendo, pero él nos va en esta ocasión a hablar de un tema que me parece que es, no me parece, yo creo que es importante y que desgraciadamente, pues muchas veces los que llegan a tomar las riendas de los países desconocen totalmente o no tienen idea de lo que deben de hacer los bancos centrales desde una posición post-keynesiana en relación a lo que es la tasa de interés, principalmente en el periodo de post-crisis. Entonces, la conferencia va a ser en inglés y le damos la palabra a Louis-Philippe.
Okay. Thank you very much. A few words before I start. First, my apologies for speaking in English. My Spanish is very limited. I am now taking Spanish lessons, and I'll come back and give a talk. How many times have I said that now? I'll come and give a talk if in Spanish soon enough. Second, I want to thank Professor Guiron for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come to UNAM. It's a wonderful university. It's a wonderful city, and I had a great time this week. Thank you very much. I enjoyed meeting some of the students yesterday as well, and it's just a great place to do post-Keynesian and heterodox research. My talk today is a slightly different title. I want to say from the outset that the crisis certainly challenges the way central banks are seen from the mainstream. From a post-Keynesian perspective, the crisis changes very little. We still argue the same things before the crisis and after the crisis, perhaps with much more of an emphasis, because of the crisis has just showed us that what we have been saying for a few decades now still apply. The paper today is a paper that comes out of research that I was doing a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, on Taylor rules. And I wrote a first paper criticizing Taylor rules and whether new consensus models had endogenous money, which they don't. But it came from that criticism, that line of questioning. And at the time, I was trying to find an alternative to Taylor rules from a post-Keynesian perspective. And my original paper way back was to use interest rates as a counter-cyclical way to target not inflation, but maybe unemployment or capacity utilization. And then I sort of thought that this was perhaps too close to Taylor rules. It didn't really differentiate post-Keynesian sufficiently from new consensus models in that sense. And so I started reading up the old literature again, and I realized that there were very different post-Keynesians. There were sort of these two traditions within post-Keynesians when it came to endogenous money or interest rates, and which I will talk about today. And I thought that was very interesting. And so I wrote a first paper on that, which I presented at one of my conferences in Dijon. And it was well received, and I continued, and then I teamed up with a friend and a colleague of mine, Mark Setterfield, to do some modeling, some growth models using and distribution using these interest rate rules from a post-Keynesian perspective. So this is what I'm doing today. Now, to this audience, I don't have to explain much. The idea that central banks no longer control the money supply, I think, is a given fact. Personally, I think central banks never really controlled the money supply, but it's certainly made more apparent today. The central banks control the rate of interest. The rate of interest is an administered price. It is set at any level that the central banks want. This goes back to Keynes, who wrote back in 1945 in some correspondence with Henderson, the central bank can have any interest rate it wants. It chooses. It simply needs to be ready to defend it. So this certainly is an inspiration to much in this paper when it comes to interest rate rules. And, the idea that central banks controlled the interest rates used to be the domain of post-Keynesians. Today, however, more and more mainstream people adopt this view. Central banks do control interest rates. This is a quote by Ben Friedman in a very recent paper. It's not even published yet. And it, in fact, comes very close to what post-Keynesians say. So there are some overlapping going on in the mainstream. And also, Alan Blinder, very similar sort of reference. But the problem with these people, with the new consensus and the mainstream economists, is, perhaps, yes, they do recognize exogeneity of the rate of interest, but they have yet to abandon the rest of their views. There's still a link between monetary policy and inflation, and the traditional sort of mainstream view on monetary policy. The only thing that's changed is central banks. It's not that they don't. It's not that they cannot control the money supply. It's that they choose not to control the money supply. So there's a slight emphasis, a different emphasis. But so if the idea of an exogenous interest rates emerges in the mainstream literature, let's just go back to the post-Keynesians. And when I started rereading the old classics like Randy Ray and Basil Moore and others, I noticed that there were sort of two kind of views out there, two kind of approaches, two kind of schools. What I called the activist post-Keynesians and the parking it post-Keynesians. And the activist post-Keynesians are people like Giuseppe Fontana and Tom Pally. Even Basil Moore is an activist. And, in fact, if you read Basil's 1988 book on the horizontalism and structuralism and verticalist, horizontalists and verticalists, there's a passage in there where he says interest rate could be used to, countercyclically to fight inflation even and unemployment. And Basil says that Taylor was one of his students, and to this day, Basil thinks that he's the one who put the seed in Taylor's head about Taylor rules. But anyways, so they use interest rates in a counter-cyclical way. But of course, post-Keynesians reject the idea that monetary policy is somehow linked to inflation. So instead of having an inflation target, they will argue that there should be an unemployment target, a growth target. Jerry Epstein argues for a capacity utilization target. And so it's actually quite similar to a Taylor rule. Is the idea is that you use interest rates to fight the cycle. Not much difference. And I'm not going to say much about the activists today. The other post-Keynesian tradition, perhaps more Kelekian in nature, argues that, the central banks argues against what we call monetary policy dominance. So it sort of not only attacks the idea of Taylor rules as a counter-cyclical tool, interest rates, but also the idea that monetary policy should be used at all. So the benchmark or the parking it approach argues that the relationship between interest rates and output, not very clear. It's certainly complicated. It's certainly not linear. And so because of that, any use of interest rates as a counter-cyclical tool is inefficient. And so what happens, you have central banks raising interest rates 10, 12 times, and finally it reaches its inflation target, but by deflating and crushing the real economy. So what we argue is, or the parking it approach, that you should not use monetary policy at all or very rarely. Instead, you should simply park the interest rate at a given level and leave it there for, a period of time, and then fall back on fiscal policy. It's sort of a mea culpa that post-Keynesians have perhaps emphasized monetary policy way too much in the last 20 years. And so we've sort of neglected fiscal policy. There's even now amongst the Kansas people seeing monetary policy as fiscal policy. Now they argue, and I'm not completely disagreeing with them, that there is no such thing as monetary policy. There is only fiscal policy. The use of interest rates really is fiscal policy. So this is a quote by Lavoie and Godley. Fiscal policy can be used just as efficiently as monetary policy. So why use monetary policy, especially since it can have very disturbing effects? Now, both the activists and the parking it approach, both are certainly rooted in Keynes and Kaldorf's sort of endogenous money tradition. Both reject the central bank focus on inflation targeting and the mainstream discussion of monetary transmission mechanisms. Both accept the cost push nature or conflict nature of inflation. And both question the validity of central banks' policy in fighting inflation. So this is a great quote going back quite some years. Lavoie, this I think 1996, I think it's one of his best paper that was published in the Scottish Journal of Political Economy. You should really read it. It then becomes clear that monetary policy should not be much to be designed to control a level of activity, but rather to find a level of interest rate that will be proper for the economy from a distribution point of view. So more so, the parking it approach, the interest rate is an income distributive variable. And that's really what the interest rate is. Interest rates should be used to minimize conflict over income shares. So, like I said, I'm not going to be discussing the activist rule, the activist approach. I'm concentrating on the parking it approach. And here I concluded, I saw there were sort of three traditions in this tradition. And I'm sorry for those who heard me yesterday. I'm going to repeat one of my jokes. The Smithin rule, named after John Smithin, who was very happy that I named it the Smithin rule. He argues that the real rate of interest should be zero, close to zero, but zero for all intensive purposes. The Kansas City rule, so defended by people like Randy Ray, Eric Timoang, Matt Forstater, Pavlina Choneva, and others argue that the nominal rate of interest should be zero. So you're really talking about perhaps negative real rates of interest. And what we've called the Pazinetti rule, or what I've called the Pazinetti rule, the real rate of interest should be equal to the rate of growth of labor productivity. So you sort of have these three rules. There's quite a lot of research now being done on these three rules. Research being done by Timoang and people in Germany like Eckhard Hein, Mark Setterfield, myself, a couple of students in France. So it lends itself well to modeling. You've got these three rules that you can plug into a model, which is essentially what I'm going to be doing today. There are some similarities between or among the parking at views. They've got different distributional implications and certainly differences with respect to the relative place of the rentier class within society. The Pazinetti, also called the fair rate rule, sees the rentier class as a necessary evil. It sort of keeps constant the distribution of the distribution of income. The Kansas City and the Smithen rules advocate the euthanasia of the rentier. There's a debate between John Smithen and Randy Ray on that point, on who can claim the mantle of Keynes on that topic. Did Keynes imply a zero real rate or zero nominal rate? So both rules advocate a distribution away from rentiers. The Pazinetti rule, monetary policy is neutral in terms of the distribution of income. According to Pazinetti, all individuals, when they engage in debt-credit relations, should obtain at any time an amount of purchasing power that is constant in terms of labor. In other words, it preserves the intertemporal distribution of income between borrowers and lenders. In this paper, I seek to address the Smithen question. In other words, if you're parking the rate of interest at a certain level for a long period of time, what should that level be? And second, what are the macroeconomic consequences of those different rules? So, as a first conclusion, monetary policy is ineffectual in fighting inflation or any other real variables. Monetary transmission mechanism between interest rates and economic variables is unreliable and certainly more complex than the mainstream lead us to believe. So monetary policy should be avoided as an instrument of stabilization policy. This is quite familiar to people here. But, interest rates still matter, of course, but they matter from an income distribution perspective, and that can have consequences on effective demand, both in the short run and the long run. Monetary policy is no longer the only game in town, but it brings back fiscal policy, which has been more or less, or relatively, or completely ignored from new consensus models. The model I'm going to present today has four components to it. The first is an inflation and a distribution of income component. The second part of the model is an economic growth component. The third is technical progress. And the fourth is a monetary policy component. And this is where we can use those interest rate rules in order to look at macroeconomic outcomes. And I'll present all four of these sections. Each will have some sort of equations. Some of them will be certainly familiar to most people, to a lot of people here. And then we'll go with the reduced form model. The first equation is, this doesn't show, right? No. So the first equation simply says that the rate of growth of nominal wages is a function of a target wage share from workers omega W minus the actual wage share. So workers are constantly fighting for an increase in wage share. Mu means that between 0 and 1 it means simply that workers are never successful 100% in obtaining a growth in their nominal wages, that there is some concessions. Q is simply the rate of growth of labor productivity, and PE is expected inflation. The second equation is the price equation. Here we have a very similar in the sense that prices are administered again, and they are set according to the real the real wage share of workers, and then firms have their own target wage share. Plus nominal wages minus Q is simply unit labor cost. The third equation simply says that the target wage share of workers should be, although I relax this in the paper, as you'll see, is a positive function of growth. So as the economy grows, we expect workers to target a higher wage share. The second component of this model is very traditional Keynesian equations with a little twist. We have the growth rate is a function of capacity utilization. And most models, Cambridge models, would probably only have the equation a function of the gross rate of profit. What we do in this paper is that we actually add a component, I lambda. I is the nominal rate of interest, and lambda is the ratio of corporate debt to the aggregate capital stock. And what that does, we call that corporate profits. What that does is that it allows us to bring interest rates directly into a Keynesian model of growth. And that will be able to add the different interest rate rules. The second equation is quite familiar. It's a savings function. Here we assume, of course, like it often is, that the marginal propensity to save out of wages is 0. And the third equation is, by definition, the Cambridge rate of profit equation. So, we can rearrange with some dynamic stability conditions, and we arrive at very familiar neo-Keynesian results. And in the end, the last two equations at the bottom, we notice that the growth regime is both stagnationist and wage-led, which is something that we would expect. I'll make the paper available as well to those who want to look at the equations and the model more carefully. The third component is the technical progress component, which encapsulates a Verdun effect. So increased economic growth results in dynamic increasing returns and hence faster productivity growth. We linearize this equation, and we can take some again subject to certain conditions. And as before, we noticed that the dynamics of productivity growth are also wage-led. And then the final component, the fourth component of the model, is monetary policy. And here, there's always been sort of a debate in these Keynesian or Cambridge growth models on how to incorporate monetary policy or interest rates. So this is the way we do it. So here you have the three rules. Equation 12 is your interest rate rule. And then, of course, different values of the beta P and the beta Q will result in the fair rate, the Smithian rule, and the Kansas City rule. So I here is the nominal rate of interest. We can write it in equation as an equilibrium equation. And so what we end up having is, if you go back to the different sections, when we are able to to solve and manipulate, you end up with sort of the reduced form, equation 5 in this case, and you have these 4 equations here. So you have a price equation, a growth equation, a technical progress, and an interest rate equation. So these are the 4 equations that summarize the model. We can go further, we can substitute, we can play around, and then we end up really with 2 equations. So equation 5 prime and equation 15. 5 prime is what we call the inflation frontier. Equation 15 is the growth frontier. So what we notice here is that with inflation, the rate of interest rises, which of course is how we define our interest rate rule. It lowers growth and it reduces labor productivity. Now this point here is going to play because when we compare the Smithian rule with the Pazzinetti rule, Smithian rule is not a function of Q. So this will play in the Pazzinetti equilibrium. So this is what we have, just a general diagram, sort of a post-Keynesian, Keynesian growth model with monetary policy. You have on top, you have the growth frontier, the inflation frontier. You have on the lower right-hand side, you have that interest rate rule, positive in inflation, and the 2 main diagrams. So then we can go back and we can then play around with those interest rate rules. So if we go back to these 2 equations, 5 prime and 15, now notice that in 15 you've got beta p's and beta q's, and by substituting the values of 0 or 1 for the different interest rate rules, we end up with a different growth frontier. Now, here, the first 15 prime, it's Q star H. Originally, I wanted to call that the horizontalist rule, but I settled on the Pazzinetti rule. But I haven't changed some of the equations. So the Pazzinetti rule, by substituting the values of 1, we end up with the growth frontier for the Pazzinetti interest rate rule. The Smithian rule, we end up with the Smithian growth frontier. I'm not going to deal with the Kansas City right now. I'm just going to compare the Pazzinetti rule with the Smithian rule. We can show that the Smithian growth frontier is both steeper and has a larger intercept term. So once we've established, so we can see it here. The top being the intercept and then the slope. And then by substituting the values of betas in both of these intercept and slope, we can show that the Smithian rule is both steeper and a larger intercept. So what does that do? It gives us this, this diagram. So it's the same diagram as before. The first one was simply the generic one, but now we have 2 growth frontiers in this one. So we have a growth frontiers H for the Pazzinetti growth frontiers and the Smithian one. And we notice that the Smithian rule has a higher intercept and a steeper curve. And so we notice here that, not too surprising, the interest rate in the Pazzinetti rule is higher. Growth is lower. So if you look at the intersection between the growth frontiers, wait, does anyone have a laser? Okay, so we have the growth frontiers where they intersect the inflation frontier. We notice that, I can't even see what's up there again. Oh yeah, so growth is higher under the Smithian rule, interest rates are lower and inflation is lower, whereas under the Pazzinetti rule, growth is lower, inflation higher, and the rate of interest is higher. However, as inflation, so growth will be higher and inflation lower with the Smithian rule. The lower interest rates in equation 13 leads to higher growth, higher productivity, and therefore lower inflation under the Pazinetti rule. However, as inflation rises, interest rates rise as well, leads to a greater fall in growth than in the Pazinetti rule. This is because under the Pazinetti rule, there's a smoothing effect. Higher inflation leads to higher rates of interest, depressing the rate of growth, depressing labor productivity, which lowers the rate of interest. So there's a smoothing effect, and that's the nature of why that Pazinetti rule is not as steep. So the drop in growth is not as pronounced under the Pazinetti rule. Now, we're going to compare two situations. Situations of growth and a situation of recession. This is a growth regime. And we know this is a growth regime because the intersection of the Pazinetti and Smithian growth frontiers, if you equate those two growth frontiers, you end up having a growth rate of 0. And so, because they intersect the inflation frontier above the intersection of the two growth frontiers, we know that this represents a growth regime. And sure enough, we know this is a growth regime because of the intersection of both growth frontiers. We have this, and therefore Q star equals 0, so there's no growth. And so therefore, they intersect the inflation barrier above, and it's a growth regime. So what does this mean? So what does this mean is that in a growth regime, we should actually favor a Smithian rule. So in a growth regime, the Smithian rule gives us higher growth, lower inflation, and lower interest rates. So if we are in a growth regime, the central banks should follow a Smithian rule of having real interest rates close to 0. That's what it means. But there's an issue. As the economy moves through the cycle and goes in from a growth to a recession, something happens. In this case, we know this is a recession because the intersection of both frontiers up there signifies a no growth regime. So the intersection with those growth frontiers and the inflation frontiers is below that intersection. So it's a negative growth regime. In this situation, it means that the Pazinetti rule should be followed because the Pazinetti rule is the higher growth, lower inflation, lower rate of interest regime. So it means that through a recession or through a cycle, interest rate should not be used to counter that cycle, but to help that cycle along. So it's a very different perspective than Taylor rules and activist rules. So there's sort of a switching or re-switching going on with respect to interest rates. So in a recession, central banks should actually follow Pazinetti rules and setting real interest rates equal to labor productivity. So the Pazinetti rule is a high growth, low inflation policy during a recession, and the Smithian rule plays the same role in a positive growth regime. Now, we have extended this model and we've included fiscal policy in it as well, which I'm not going to do today. That's a different paper that I did. But it's interesting to see how fiscal, and the conclusions are sort of very similar. So our conclusions hold for the most part, but it's a bit more dynamic by introducing fiscal policy. When we introduced Kansas City rule, and, you know, I'm not a big fan of Kansas City rules. I just don't believe that nominal rates should be set to 0. I think central banks should control real rates. I think central banks control real rates, both short-term and long-term real rates. The problem with Kansas City that I see is I find, and it's not born out of this model, so there's an inconsistency in what I say. and what I show. But I still believe that the Kansas City rule is destabilizing because, in essence, you have real rates of interest being 0. So we go back to equation 15 from before, which had those betas, and then we simply substitute the values of betas, which we've done in this one, for 1s, but we substitute them essentially for 0. And then we end up with the Kansas City growth frontier. And the growth frontier is horizontal. In other words, growth is independent of inflation. Equilibrium productivity growth is constant, and the rate that would emerge from this, regardless of the rate of interest. So the rate of growth is constant. So by adding the Kansas City rule, we end up with the horizontal Kansas City rule, which has the same intercept as the Smithian rule. But here we notice that growth is higher, inflation lower under the Kansas City rule. And this is certainly gives us pause for reflection. It certainly directly challenges mainstream. Low interest rate leads to low inflation. And this is certainly consistent with the Kansas City rule. It's consistent in a sense with the overall post-Keynesian emerging literature in this, that low interest rates are not destabilizing and not inflationary. So the conclusion here is that regardless of the regime, the growth or recession regime, regardless of that regime, the central bank should always follow a Kansas City rule. I don't agree with that. And I think that I've had some discussion with people in Berlin, with Eckhard Hein and Engelbert Stockhammer and these people. And they've sort of showed us why we get this result. We're in the process of sort of incorporating some of their criticism. But it has to do with interest payments and of the like. And so we're still trying to muddle through. But so that's essentially... So that's essentially the paper. There's still a lot of research to do. There are a few people in England doing stock flow models using these interest rate rules and sort of comparing the results. I look forward to reading their question. But what it does show is that regardless of the crisis, and we've all heard the argument that the crisis was partly to blame on low interest rates in the United States, this certainly does not say that. Low interest rates, hell, 0, you can't go lower than 0, lower nominal bound on interest rates. So what it does say is that it is not destabilizing, it is not speculative. And so the central bank, pre or post-crisis, should always sort of follow certainly monetary policy that euthanizes the rentiers, should keep interest rates low. It's good from an income distribution perspective, and from a growth perspective, and that's it.
Thank you very much.